The Rape of the Mind, Chapter 14. The Turncoat in Each One of Us. The confusing influence of the problem of treason and loyalty. As soon as treason is mentioned, something in man's soul is stirred. Anger and scorn, suspicion and anxiety are aroused. People want to avoid the subject. The social reaction toward a traitor, even before we are certain that the accusation is deserved, is well spectacular. Former friends of a man accused as a traitor retreat and withdraw from this token of evil. In every trial of traitors, we feel inwardly personally accused and guilty. This is one of the reasons that treason trials make such a deep impression and provoke the most confusing discussion. Dictators can use such trials to cast a spell on the public. In a book, Amidst of Coercion and the Rape of the Mind, an investigation of the problem of treason and loyalty is needed. The involuntary traitor. Self-betrayal comes out of all human pores. Sigmund Freud. In my hometown in Holland, there was a little barber shop quite near the government buildings. It was owned by a small man with a grey French beard. Through the years, he had served many of the country's most important men, diplomats and cabinet ministers, proud generals and aggressive leaders of the opposition. They all wanted his service. The little barber was always very courteous and agreeable, eager to please his clients. He danced with prim, several gestures around them while curling their hair and looking after their mustaches. As he worked, he could ask his distinguished clients polite questions. What is His Excellency so-and-so going to say about this bill? How does the Minister of the State feel about that one? He was not really interested in politics at all, but the little barber knew that his clients were flattered by such questions. And then one day a puffy, baribold German general walked in and settled himself in a barber's chair. The Netherlands had been invaded and occupied by the Nazi holders. Of course, our barber knew this, and he had even managed to hate the invaders for a few days, but he was intensely a gentle soul, and he lathered the general's face himself and took care not to soil his uniform. On succeeding days, others of these strangely uniformed men appeared in his shop, and the little barber served them all well. The military men were followed by the brown shirts and then the grey shirts and the Gestapos. The leather of the barber's chair was stuffed by huge black boots, but the little barber did not complain, and soon the occupiers considered his haircut the most fashionable and the best he could obtain in the entire city. Our barber was not conscious of his increasing official importance. He danced attendance to his new clients with such a courtesy as he had showed the diplomats of the old days. He was sorry that his old acquaintances had gradually disappeared, but in the past his work had been seasonal. When Parliament was not in session, now his business flourished all the time. The Germans and the collaborators liked the little barber shop, the perfume, the barber's skill. Indeed, our amiable friend was well liked by the uniform oppressors. They were, after all, thoroughly unused to friendly treatment. The barber's behavior was a welcome chance from the contempt in which most of the Dutch people, though stupid, stubborn resistors, regarded them. One day the barber was invited to buy a membership card in a newly formed organization of collaborators. Our friend responded to this request as he would have to any other appeal for charity. He did not like to give, but he thought of the welfare as a small tax on business, and so he resigned himself to paying as petty, necessary annoyance. Some of his old acquaintances warned him of the consequences. He would be accused of collaboration and treason, but he pacified them, saying, "I am a barber and I live as a barber. I have absolutely no interest in politics. I only want to serve my clients." When, after the bitter days of the struggle and oppression, liberation came, our friend came officially known as the traitor and a collaborator. When the black-booted and uniformed supermen were thrown out, their collaborating friends were imprisoned, the barber among them. After he had served a part of his sentence, a wise and forgiving judge sent out the barber back to his little shop. The first excitement of liberation had passed, and people were becoming more willing to forgive those who had been collaborators because they had been weak-hearted. Our story is no means finished. The barber came back from prison a beaten man. He had been in jail for 3 months. He still could not understand what happened to him. He brooded constantly over his shameful days in jail. An injustice had been done to him. He had served his fellow men as well as behaved, virtuous citizen should, and he had been treated like a criminal. He had served his fellow men as well-behaved, virtuous citizens should, and he had been treated like a criminal. He felt self-righteous, abused, insulted, maltreated, and misunderstood. After all, he had only wanted to be kind and helpful. He was a Baba, nothing more. The Baba could not rid himself of his bitterness and resentment. None of his former friends came to cheer him up or to sympathize with him. His old clans did not return. His sadness and depression increased daily, and in a few months he took his own life. And so ended the adventures of a little Baba who had been completely unaware of his corroboration and his treachery. I knew this man. I did not despise him, not at all. I am sure there are many such pitiful corroborators. I wonder, though, why the little Baba was so unaware. Was it stupidity? Had his apparent kindness always covered up a resentment against his fellow men? Was he misled by the insidious wave of suggestion stronger than his mental capacity to resist? We will never know. This tragedy, caused perhaps by unawareness, perhaps the inability to choose between conflicting loyalties, stimulated to me to investigate the problem of the traitor. I had ample opportunity to study this question, both through my experience with the Dutch underground during the Nazi occupation and when I was imprisoned in the Vinch detention camp. My first official analysis was made in 1943 when the Dutch government asked me to prepare a psychological report on disloyal Dutch soldiers and citizens being held in detention in the Isle of Man. I arrived at the prison after a hazardous, stormy journey in a small airplane. The prisoners were a sorry lot. I had anticipated hostility, but I had not expected to find so many weaklings consumed by bitterness and anger. Some of them were typical of the passive, egotistic, psychopathic personality whose motto seems to be, "Let the world go to hell. I will never conform." Others seemed to be the victims of the unbearable inner struggle, a conflict between their desire to belong to the stronger group and their resistance to this desire, a resistance which only increased their bitterness and antagonism. This was a situation which proved to me again that there are certain times when logic and discussion are no help at all. We tried over and over again to convince the semi-corroborators that they should join with us in the fight against the Nazis, but they only retreated further behind their private grudges. They even refused the cigarettes I offered them. Bad as the trip to the prison had been, the trip back was even worse. The little plane was pushed of course by strong winds. I was depressed and disgusted by my experience, and when we finally arrived in England, both the pilot and I were sick. I had many opportunities thereafter to study spies, traitors and submersives. My last official wartime investigation took me to a prison camp in Sumerian, Dutch Guinea, where I made a collective report on all the inhabitants of the prison camp. In many of them, I could discern neurotic and even psychotic traits, but I had found that perhaps the best understanding of the problem of treason has come to me from the psychiatric work with neurotic patients who had to face the daily struggle with the literal betrayals of everyday life, with their own self-betrayal and with their ambivalent feelings towards those they should love. The concept of treason. Before looking into the subject further, let us make an inquiry into the meaning of the word treason. It is, after all, used in a confusing variety of senses. The word treason has many social and political implications, and the customs, habits, mores of the group in which it is used affect the color its meaning. The word itself is derived from the Latin trendare or trendare, to deliver long free, to betray, to give something across, to give loyalty and secrets away. But from this root, the word has acquired a variety of meanings. In the first place, it has a purely emotional individual meaning related to feelings of deprivation and injustice. The infant often experiences all that compels him out of his state of bliss and independency. The infant often experiences all that compels him out of his state of bliss and dependency, which means the very act of growing up as a betrayal, and sees treason in what he considered a rejection by his parents. The person who retains this infantile feeling in adult life may react to every fancied slight or rejection to an act of treason or betrayal. Lack of solidarity with the family or clan, with the in-group, not conforming to its rituals and taboos has often been interpreted by the group as treason through dissent. In this sense, the word implies a primitive moral evaluation, disgust, and contempt are associated with it. Treason indicates something deeply emotional, something taboo, something different or strange, like allegiance to an alien ideology, a breach of tradition, or the simple fact of being a foreigner. Rejection of the norms and rules of community, being's own judge of morality and ethics, is often considered treasonable. Utter rejection of the tradition of one's fatherland is an extreme. Often simple nonconformity may be considered treasonable too. Indeed, in totalitarian, nonconformity and dissent are the most serious crimes against the system, and totalitarian minds have the tendency to look upon even honest mistake or differences of opinion as deliberate treachery. Because of its deep emotional content, the very word itself can be used as a political tool with which to manipulate people. In totalitarian, it becomes merely a Pavlovian sign, triggering of reaction of distrust and hatred. After a military defeat or a diplomatic disappointment, or whatever feeling of humiliation and inadequacy ran high among the people, it is a useful strategy to get them to project their sense of inferiority onto others. The traitor is in such a case easy scapegoat who satisfies the collective need to project blame and relieve unconscious anxiety. In a totalitarian society, every citizen is compelled to become a traitor, according to our own Western sense of decency, because it is his duty to betray to the regime every expression of dissension and rebellion. The child has to report his father, the father his child, and they are even called traitors in the totalitarian sense as soon as they fail to report. In the common political interpretation, treason is an act of rebellion, sedition, cynicism, heresy, conspiracy, and subversion. Its technical juridical meaning is well known to everybody. Treason is adhering to enemies and giving aid and comfort to them. It is also, in a more modern and modified sense, taking part in an international ideological conspiracy against the fatherland. To me, as a psychiatrist, its relation to the general problem of self-betrayal is the key of an understanding of the word. The germ of treason arises first in the individual's compromises with his own principles and beliefs. After these compromises have been made, it becomes easier to go on and to make more and more compromises until finally the compromiser may become the man who is willing to sell himself and his services to the highest bidder. During the Nazi occupation, we saw this among those who were seduced to do little services for the enemy. The first step led to the second and then to the final collaboration. It is because all of us do doubt ourselves from time to time, because we are unsure of what we will do if we are put to the test, and because we may see in ourselves a potential traitor, that the word treason has such highly emotional appeal. But self-doubt is a far cry from the actual treason, and the real traitor, in the morbid sense of the word, is not merely a self-doubter. He is a man who believes only in his ultra-personal rights and who scorns the rights and wishes of the community. He is disloyal even to his own gang. Hitler, for example, was a traitor not only to his own ideas, handling them as chargeable tools to help him gain and maintain power, he was repeatedly a traitor to his closest friends and collaborators, many of whom he betrayed and murdered in 1934 during what has been called the Night of the Long Knives. The real traitor is a person with the egocentric delusion and the conscious conviction that he alone is right. He is a very different type from an involuntary, pathetic, unaware traitor like our little Baba, the traitor who consciously takes opinion for the other side. In my study of political traitors and collaborators, I found that most of them shared a common characteristics. They were easily influenced by minds stronger than their own, and none of them would admit his disloyalty as an act of treason. The traitors I interviewed always volunteered innumerable justification of their behavior, always surrounded their treachery with a complicated web of sophism and rationalizations. Actually, they could not tolerate an objective picture of their actions. If they did, they would condemn themselves out of their own mouths. Unconsciously, most of them realized the nature of their crimes and were tormented by guilt feelings. These guilt feelings would have been unbearable if they admitted, even to themselves, the enormity of their deeds. During the Nazi occupation of the Low Countries, I saw this quality demonstrated again and again. Many of our native traitors were spineless people, ready to accept almost any new idea or elaborate theory. Their suggestibility was their greatest inability. Most of these would-be Nazi had never possessed strong personalities of their own. They had failed in their ambitions and had been disappointed in life, and they later transferred their frustrated personal longings to political will-o'-the-wisp. After the German invasion and occupation, these people confronted their defeated countrymen with triumphant "I told you so." They boasted proudly of their wisdom in having to bet the right horse. They gained a tremendous feeling of self-importance, and their newly acquired, blown-up self-assurance, backed by the enemy's armed forces, made them hard and contemptuous to their compatriots. In an effort to justify their own behavior and their greed for power, they tried to convert others to their way of life. They were possessed by a compulsion to become propagandists for the invader. Turncoats always tried to soothe their own bad conscience by persuading others to share their crime. Of course, they had some real grievances. Everybody does. But these traitors were influenced less by them than the fenced injustices. Through acts of treason, they avenged themselves on society for the private wrongs they had suffered because of their personal failures. Their resentments could be felt in everything they said. The Nazi strategists were expert in exploring this sense of dissatisfaction. They seemed to know intuitively whether or not an individual could be enhanced by the Nazi propaganda. One case I knew of in Holland concerned an ex-director of a large concern who had been ousted from his position on ethical grounds. Early in the occupation, this man received an invitation to join the Nazi ranks, and in a surprisingly short time he became the leader of an important Nazi business. The Nazis gave him the feeling of having been vindicated. Among the recruits of the Nazi police force in the occupied territories were turncoats of all sorts and even the inmates of asylum for the criminally insane. The pathological grudge these people had against society was the foil for which the Nazis turned them into traitors. The Germans themselves despised these men, but they were cunning enough to put them to the best possible use. The Nazis also played a strange game with those authors and artists who had not received enough appreciation. The enemy flattered these men by buying and praising their work. The artists were first told that they could write and create as they pleased, without fear of interference. Gradually, little political services were asked of them. Tiny little concessions like a favorable report of a meeting or a favorable reference of a philosophy which they did not agree. It is the impact of the first little concession that starts the inner avalanche of self-justification that finally leads to self-betrayal. Following the first compromise and self-justification comes the second, and this one is met with the shrewder self-exculpations. After all, the compromiser has had experience in rationalization by now. The repeated concessions turn into submission and voluntary cooperation. As I said before, once a man is seduced into a small ideological concession, it is very difficult for him to stop. From now on, his imagination produces enough justification which help him maintain his self-respect. The inwardly insecure traitor always feels the urge to identify with the enemy, the hostile invader. He has never belonged, never had a feeling of identification with his own group, has never felt the rewards of such cohesion, nor has he won the love, sympathy, and respect of his fellows. Therefore, he wants to join the others. He may even go as far as to call his former friends traitors. Lord Howe, William Joyce, the British traitor who was executed by his government, considered himself a real Aryan German and in his way justified his fight against England. In the hectic days immediately following the Nazi invasion of Holland, I myself felt an occasional inner temptation to go over to the enemy, to the stronger party with its powerful organization, all ready to support one, to back one up. I even had a dream about visiting Hitler and convincing him in a childish and friendly way for the righteousness of our cause. I did not succumb to this dream temptation, but there were a few who fell for such infertile pictures and were unable to withstand their need to submit. The need to conform, to be accepted, to be safe and respectable is deeply embedded in man. In our analysis of the inner forces that led men to surrender their mental integrity under the pressure of prison and concentration camp life, we saw how important a role this mechanism plays. Living in a country occupied by the enemy is by no means as horrifying as living in a prisoner of war camp or concentration camps, but it is, nevertheless, frightening. And this frightening situation, the need to conform may show itself in surrender to the enemy ideology. Those who resisted this need, even though they felt it, usually became even more fervently anti-Nazi as a consequence of their guilty feelings about this impulse to treachery. This war experience taught us another truth. Traitors can be made by overwhelming corrective suggestions. In the ambiguous chaos of shouting ideologies and changing values, the mind becomes sullen and stubborn, and where there is immaturity and lack of inner control, it may become confused in its loyalties and simply surrender to the most powerful group. The Nazis, with their perverted political methods, tried to supply the weak, the ambitious, the disgruntled, the frustrated with a ready-made set of bogus ideals to justify surrender to their side. In Mein Kampf, Hitler says that when the disappointed are given a sense of importancy, they will swallow every suggestion with the uttermost docility. He knew that human weakness, even kindness, can be used as a starting point for systematically nurtured conversations. Hitler knew, too, that unlimited political terror could make a traitor and almost anyone. Spread fear, terror and hunger, inflict penetrating pain, and finally, as a result of mental coercion and growing confusion, many will succumb and even betray their own families. In many of the concentration camps, the victims themselves were in charge of the gas chambers killings and kept their gruesome jobs until their own turns came. Fear and terror had made willless slaves out of them. There is still another human characteristic that can lead to treason and betrayal. These are some people who simply do not know where their loyalties belong. The case of Klaus Fasch, the man who betrayed atomic secret to Russia, is a dramatic example of this. Here was a highly intelligent person, an expert of the most difficult theoretical problems, lost in a sea of conflicting loyalties. Because of the Nazi persecutions in the Quaker family, he adopted a new fatherland, England. In the meantime, he carried a dream of mystical universal world which he thought to find in the totalitarian ideology. In the midst of his confusion about world problems, he simply did not know where his loyalty should be. This was not a case of schizophrenia or darkly held situation, as the newspaper reported, but a case of confusion of loyalties in hyper-intellectual mind. Fasch did not know emotionally where he belonged. In other cases, people are literally pushed into treason and collaboration because nobody in their environment trusted them. This happened, for instance, in Flanders with the collaborators of the First World War. Several of them were compelled to become collaborators again. This analysis of the factors that led men to treason certainly do not imply that every man must remain loyal to the group from which he has originally received his morals and ideals. Better insights and higher ethics may override our childhood loyalties. It is the fate and the need for human beings to go beyond their teachers and to correct, if possible, the tradition rules of their schools. The great philosopher Socrates was accused of being a traitor because he corrupted the minds of the youth of Athens, and yet today we know that Socrates was far from being a corrupter, our treacherous intellect. Perhaps the most tragic form of unobstructive treason and self-betrayal is caused by the inertia of the human intellect. We are often betrayed by our own minds. We forget completely what we want to forget. We deny the existence of real problems in order to retreat into wishful thinking. As soon as we do not understand and feel the implication of the problem or an argument, we tend to submit passively to the most powerful side, just as did the over-friendly barber. This ease with which human beings can be corrupted is still one of the most serious psychological and moral problems. Inner confusion can make us submissive to almost any strong suggestion from the outside, no matter how foolish or false. Our doubts are traitors and make us lose the good we oft might win. By fearing to attempt, there are often many complicated tricks and intellect which lead to self-betrayal. The feeling of inferiority often arouses in ignorant people a great desire to grasp extremely difficult ideas. Such people like to identify themselves with a quasi-profound system of thought. Hitler and his abstract lighting made temporary pseudo-philosophers and magicians out of the majority of German people. All dictatorial totalitarians buy the services of scholars who can make them such a set of pseudo-philosophical justification. Unfortunately, some scholars are easy to buy. In Holland, for example, there was not too intelligent philosopher who became converted to Nazism after it had shown in an overpowering strength. Thereafter, he felt free to write the most obstructive philosophical subject and to expound the most complicated theories, all to the glorification of his powerful friends from the Third Reich and their myth of conquering the whole world. At the same time, he built a system of indestructible words around his own deep feelings of guilt. He isolated himself from the world more and more because no words were convincing enough to justify his treason to himself. In the end, he lost all contact with reality. Then, of course, the Nazis had no use for him either. Self-betrayal. As we have seen, there are various inner motivations which may lead to the crime of disloyalty or treason. Sometimes these motivations operate very subtly, in ways unknown to the subject. Sometimes treason is merely a crude selling out of those who pay best. Let us try to arrange and classify some of these motivations, starting with the unconscious ones and ranging in towards deliberate treason. In the first place, an act of self-betrayal may begin as a defense against the feeling of loss and rejection. In order to win acceptance in a group, the individual may hide and not defend his private beliefs and conviction when attacked. In psychology, this may be called, if such passive behavior becomes an unconscious habit, the passive submission to identification with a stronger person. If you cannot beat the enemy, join them. Although the concept of inner traitor in us is not so easy to accept, by studying the contrasting inner drives that lead man, one becomes more convinced of the possibility. The clinical concept of man's inner ambivalence is based on the numerous psychological experiences. In studying the deeper motivation of many a traitor, we often see that this treacherous act happened after an inner turmoil threatening to break him down, to make an uncontrolled nervous wreck out of him. It is as if the future mental patient preferred to surrender to an outward enemy rather than to an inward enemy of disease and nervous breakdown. Hess was at the verge of schizophrenic breakdown when he broke Hitler's rules and flew to England. Let us consider the British Foreign Office spies, Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess. Both showed several symptoms of imminent mental breakdown. It may be known to the reader that both of these men left England in May 1951 in order to go via France to Russia. Both deliberately fled the country. Both had communist leanings during their student days at Cambridge, but later renounced their adolescent affiliations. Both showed abnormal symptoms during their service. Maclean had a breakdown in May 1950 due to overwork and excessive drinking. Burgess was reprimanded for reckless driving while in service and for neglect of his work. Reading through the report, one is surprised by the amount of mental instability which was tolerated at such a sensitive spot of the government. Both the men had homosexual leanings that can be related to suppressed hostility of their mothers and mother country. Sometimes treason means a one-sided appeal to justice. This is found in the man who demands some sort of private protective justice, who refuses to acknowledge the subtle relationship between rights and duties. Such persons always feel continually deprived and betrayed. They are what Begler calls the injustice collectors. In their act of disloyalty, they are seeking to play the role of their own private judges. They are what Begler calls the injustice collectors. In their acts of disloyalty, they are seeking to play the role of their own private judges. Many quarrelsome and even paranoid persons have this kind of character structure. Then there is a disappointed pseudo-idealist who gradually turns into a cynic, covering his emptiness by many self-justification and exculpations. Such people can betray their intellectual disappointment in all their debunking remarks. Conflicts between parents may give rise in child to the end of betray one or both parents. Conflicts between parents may give rise in the child to the need to betray one or both parents, and this need may be transferred in later life to the need to betray the fatherland. I have often found that the unresolved ties or hate and love toward the parents play an important role in forming the turncoat personality. As we saw, this problem often lies at the root of totalitarian character structure. Although the totalitarian-minded are not definition overt traitors, some of these people can easily become traitors to free, democratic ideals, either out of compulsive allegiance to the foreign ideology or out of repetitive nonconformism. In describing special characteristics of a political group, one has to keep in mind that basic inner constructs are inherent in all people. The quasi-irrational Marxist interpretation of the world, which satisfied the need for logical clarification and reasonable organization of social life, covers anxiety created by the irrational inner forces so easily detected in totalitarian-minded. The cult of the masses often serves a defense against loneliness. The belief in the progress may be born out of vague despair and insecurity. The fear of deviationism is the fear that unity of the group will be broken. Suspicion and self-criticism help to keep, above all, the inner group together. There are several forms of inner conceit that can turn man into a traitor. The Dutch philosopher of whom I spoke earlier is an example of this, as are any of the verbose ideological apologists for totalitarianism. Lack of confidence or lack of belief in the guiding tradition and aims of one's society can also lead to hostility, then to treason. Without such traditional beliefs, suggestibility and receptivity of competing ideologies are increased. The Krauss-Foch case, which was mentioned earlier, is an example of this. The personal need to be pioneer or a martyr, often instilled by the unconscious need to suffer, may lead to a private messianic delusion and cause an attack to the traditional values of the group. Many groups consider such extremism a treacherous behavior. Another form of self-betrayal may be caused by the inability to grasp the complexity of the real world. Many people have seduced into unstable behavior, even disloyal, lack of comprehension of these complexities, and through the need to find a single, all-embarking, easy answer to the problems of human life. Who gives them a simple myth to believe in? The Nazis seduced nearly all Germans into a form of ideological treason in this way. Treason may also be a paradoxical reaction to the deep-seated neurotic sense of guilt. The neurotic strategy of accumulating more guilt coupled with the consequent development of an inner need for punishment are often a basic cause of criminal action. The treacherous deed is done precisely in order to provoke punishment. Treason may also be paid adventure, as I find it in international espionage. This kind of life fascinates the immature mind which lives in the world of mystery stories and fairy tales. Bribes with women or money make such a treason even more attractive. The enemy gratifies economic and sexual needs, and the traitor is willing to sell his integrity to the highest bidder. Overt fear and panic can also cause treason. The whole psychology of totalitarian interview and integration is based on this principle. People can be frightened and brainwashed into treason. The development of loyalty. From all this we can see that what we call treason takes place more in the emotional than in the intellectual sphere of functioning. In the course of the human growth, everybody passes through periods of inner conflict in which he has to turn his love and allegiance from one person to another, from mother to father, from parents to the entire family, from the family to the state, and from the state to mankind. The core of the problem of treason and self-betrayal is found in the difficulties which arises in the repression of the former loyalties, as each loyalty is at turn superseded by the next. Many people experience deep confusion in adolescence when, for the first time, they must leave the safe emotional protection of their homes and create new loyalties and new normal standards for themselves. It is in this period that the critical faculties are developed. In doubting the traditional truths passed by his parents, each adolescent might be called a traitor, yet he is actually being true to the self he is shaping. During the crisis of adolescence, with its increased feelings of yearning of some unknown happiness, many young people want to betray their parent home, their parents' standards. At the same time, they do not want to give up the protection the home offers. Psychologically, we know, however, that temporary disloyalty is part of the normal mental growth. In the process of individual human development, there are stages of progress which lead into initial submission to open rebellion and nonconformity. Every step towards mental maturity and independence involves the growing out of ties with the past. This growth can be accepted in different ways, with more or less overt hostility and forsaking for the past, with self-betrayal and passive submission, with renewed submission to pay off feelings of guilt, with a sworn conversation or open rebellion. In this phase of adolescence, he is especially vulnerable to totalitarian propaganda. The youth may retain from the conflict of inner growth a sense of loneliness and guilt. If he puts it to productive use, he may become what we might call a creative revolutionary. The trailblazer, whose own inner forces drive him to break with tradition, is such a man. Indeed, many of mankind's great moral and spiritual leaders, they have been leaders precisely because they broke with their rigid trammels of the past or with the ossified or the immoral elements of the present. In my own experience, I have known one such man, a German psychiatrist, whose idealism and moral sense made it impossible for him to go along with the Nazi dissection of human values, and who was hanged as a traitor for his part in the abortive German rebellion against Hitler in 1944, in praise for nonconformity. What can be done in general to combat treason, disloyalty, and self-betrayal? In the first place, the child's normal defense attitude toward authority and his need to break away from it should be watched with favorable vigilance at all times on part of the parents and educators. It is all too easy to force a child into denial of the self. Many times, later disloyalty is a reaction to faulty handling of the problems of childhood. Most traitors are made, not born. Unfortunately, this truth is often forgotten by educators who may, as a result of their own frustrated aggression, break down by force the feeling of great loyalty toward their own age group that we find among youngsters. Is it possible to decide whether or not a person is dependable? Only when we have some insight into these hidden motives and drives and into the workings of his unconscious. For complete insight, psychoanalysis is necessary. But the way the unconscious expresses itself in character traits and character defenses can give us some very important indications. A person who is easily suggestible can always be seduced into disloyalty. So can the boastful, inconsistent man, full of pride and vanity. Material egotism, desire for power, and continual hostility also lead to denial of moral values, among them loyalty. As is often true in psychology, it is easier to say what character traits the dependable person must not have than to give a positive picture of what he should look like. In general, we can say that the person who is honest with himself and shows a minimum of self-deceit, the man who exhibits a stable structure of character, the person with genuine maturity, is most true to himself and as a result most loyal to others. Nevertheless, the seed of treason lies in each one of us and may be fortified by environmental influences. In a totalitarian world, for example, everybody is educated in self-denial and self-betrayal. When a person becomes an nonconformist, the label traitor will be attached to him. In a world stifled by dogma and tradition, every form of original thinking may be called sedition and treason. In such case, the environment, social and political factors, and not the confusing inner processes, determine what is treason. In this chapter, however, I have emphasized the personal factors in producing treason. In the process of family and group prejudices, and the inner instability resulting from complication in the immediate environment, there are so many subtle fantasies of self-betrayal and secret aggression in everyone, and there is so much desire to revenge secret resentment that any government may take use of these unhealthy neurotic feelings to stir up the country. The loyalty compulsion. Recently, Americans have been looking more critically into the concepts of loyalty and subversion. Deeply conscious of the cynical and the ruthless nature of the totalitarian attack through subversion, we have begun to let our fear of subversion from within paralyze our democratic freedoms. We have become so concerned over the specter of treacherous fifth column in our own land that we have grown both overcautious and suspicious. We have become so concerned over the specter of a treacherous fifth column in our own land that we have grown both overcautious and oversuspicious. We require constant reassurance that the intention of our neighbors and fellow citizens are acceptable and loyal. The danger in this frantic search for security operates both on the political and the psychological levels. Politically, in trying to elect invariable against the spread of totalitarian ideas, we may find that we have given up those very qualities that distinguish democracy from totalitarianism: freedom and diversity. Psychologically, we may find ourselves the victim of pathological suspicion, which can be critically termed as paranoia, and this suspicion may lead us to reject utterly the most valuable qualities we have as human beings: tolerance and respect for our fellow men. The political dangers in this situation have been pointed out time and time again by the responsible leaders of the American community. As a psychiatrist, I should like to devote my attention to the psychological aspects of this problem and to the dangers of the free mind that are inherent in the current situation. For as we have already seen, All political behavior is essentially an extension of the individual behavior and is rooted in the psychological of the individual who make up the political group. Much of our collective suspicion can be attributed to a gigantic multiplication with the personal feelings of insecurity. In times of fear and calamity arises the myth of treacherous aggression, the myth the totalitarian know so well how to exploit. Our own inner insecurity is displaced and projected onto our neighbors and our environment. We begin to doubt and distrust ourselves. We begin to doubt and distrust everyone. We accuse others because we are afraid of ourselves. We feel weak and cover our weaknesses by growing suspicion and being continually on the lookout for possible traitors and deserters. As we have seen earlier, the whole question of loyalty is a complicated one. In our zeal to create guarantees of trustworthiness, we tend to oversimplify the problem, and thus we may overshoot the mark and become like our totalitarian antagonist, for whom the oversimplification is a stock in trade. Asking people for loyalty oath, asking them to perform the magical ritual through which they forswear all past and future political sin, may have a paradoxical effect. Merely taking an oath does not make a man loyal, although this may later enable a judge to prosecute him to perjury. Our insistence on official expression of allegiance actually discredits and devalues the basic personal sense of voluntary and self-chosen identification with community, which is the sense of loyalty. It certainly does not either create an insecure loyalty. The loyalty oath too easily degenerates into an empathy formula, and the man who takes may forget completely the meaning it is supposed to have. Too many it has become simply red tape, another one of those endless, troublesome forms that must be filled out. The oath compulsion can easily grow into a childish magic strategy, a form of mental blackmail. There are some Oriental religions in which devotism is performed through the use of a player wheel. When the wheel is set in motion by a flip of the hand, the worshipper has done his job. He need not to recite any prayers, he need not to think devout thoughts. The practitioners of these religions no longer have any awareness of the content of their prayers. They are blind subscribers to rituals whose meaning they have long since forgotten. Signing a loyalty oath can become empty gesture as turning the prayer wheel. True loyalty is not a static thing. As we have already seen, it grows and develops into personality. It has to be rediscovered and re-experienced every day. Since it is, essentially, as a result of an inner battle of contending values that man finds his own particular values and loyalties. When a man is compelled to swear to his loyalty, even though he feels it already deeply within him, the compulsion from outside means that he must lay aside his personal right to wing values and take counsel with his honest principles. It does not matter whether or not the oath is an expression of his true feelings. The element of enforcement that lives behind it can be a psychologically weakening effect on the man who takes it. This may seem strange to the first glance, but a simple analogy will make it clear. The man who truly loves his wife, for example, does not need to repeatedly to swear to his love. He shows it in his action. But if she insists on his swearing, the very insistence, implying as it does that she doubts him, may bring questions to her husband's mind as he begins to grow confused as to what he really thinks. Both in demanding an oath and taking it, we penetrate the ridiculous illusion that enemies can be kept out through this player wheel system. The fact is that deliberate traitors and subversaries are the very ones who are not afraid to disguise their motivation and hide their intention behind the prescribed formulations. Nor are they afraid of perjurious charges. They feel no hesitation in signing an oath if it is opportune for them to do so. For them, words and oaths are only tools which have no binding moral rule. More important than the demand for loyalty should be the demand for integrity, for steadiness of character, for maturity of aims and motivation. Free man needs loyalty to the self first of all, and this implies the right to be himself. The man who feels that he is nothing, who feels that everyone, himself included, doubts him, who is inwardly weak, may become an easy prey of all kinds of totalitarian political influences. Loyalty hounds and loyalty oaks may provoke disloyalty to one's personal integrity and to personal freedom. Since they create suspicion in ourselves and in others, freedom is kept upright by the very presence of opposition, even at the risk of nonconformism and scattered subversion. Loyalty comes about as a result of mutual confidence. It cannot be created through compulsion. Any compulsion is, by its very nature, one-sided. Loyalty has to be deserved and won daily through mutual interaction and through contact between leaders and citizens. Because it is based on confidence, loyalty is given spontaneously and of free will. True loyalty cannot be bought or demanded. In investigating the case of the young American soldiers in Korea who were brainwashed and forgot too easily their loyalty lay, we usually find in their backgrounds how disloyal one of their parents had behaved toward them. In nearly all the so-called pro-communist cases, we find the disturbed youth. It is important that the community investigates its initial loyalty toward these young men. In a democratic state, we should be prepared to adduce convincing facts in support of our own way of life, or to develop new approaches which will reveal the weaknesses of any submersive system. Perceptions of dissenting ideas, insistence on loyalty according to some prescribed formula. This makes it impossible for us to do this and may be the beginning of an unwillingness to argue and persuade. They may even lead to a new form of betrayal, the subtle treason of intellectual detachment, the unwillingness to take responsibility, the treason of doubting liberalism, which leads to inaction. It may degenerate into a dangerous form of mental laziness, which can easily be turned into a life of non-commitments or into a totalitarian submission. The approaches to truth are multifarious, and it is only where there is a crash of opinion that these approaches can be discovered and the right road to truth be found. The danger in the loyalty compulsion is, then, that we may conceal mental apathy behind a rigid formula and thus lose sight of the constant need for psychological alertness and the real meaning of loyalty and the free way of life. The mechanical formula of loyalty, oath, becomes its check normal alertness, and search for ethical clarification may be by beginning of the thought control we all fear. True loyalty is a living, dynamic quality. In the subtle choice between loyalty to people and loyalty to principles, usually a vaguer feeling, the lawmaker has to leave the individual as free as possible, because the latter type of loyalty is based on the first. Without personal loyalty, there is no national loyalty. There is still another aspect of this problem. We must learn to distinguish between disloyalty in action and disloyalty in feelings and thoughts. Subversion of opinion is never a crime. The right to dissent is the keystone of democracy. In a free state, we must be willing to correct subversion by our own better arguments. Persecuting dissenting ideas is a form of mental laziness. Psychologically speaking, a government cannot concern itself with conscious motivation and the unconscious motivations which cannot be separated from them, or people, because inwardly everybody has contrasting motivation. The quandary that such a government will provide itself uninstructed is illustrated by the following quotation from the Oppenheimer hearing by the Grey Board published in 1954. There is still another aspect of this problem. We must learn to distinguish between disloyalty in action and disloyalty in feelings and thought. Subversion of opinion is never a crime. The right to dissent is the keystone of democracy. In the free state, we must be willing to correct subversion by our own better arguments. Persecuting dissenting ideas is a form of mental laziness. Psychologically speaking, a government cannot concern itself with conscious motivations and unconscious motivation which cannot be separated from them, of people, because inwardly everybody has a contrasting motivation. The quandary that such a government will provide itself is illustrated by the following quotation from the Oppenheimer hearing by the Grey Board published in 1954. We believe that it has been demonstrated that the government can search its own soul and the soul of an individual whose relationship to its government is in question with full protection of the rights and interests of both. We believe that loyalty and security can be examined within the framework of the tradition and inviolable principles of the American justice. In these beautiful phrases lie hidden all the ominous beginnings of totalitarian thought control. The government that searches the soul of any thinking individual can always find a case against him, because doubt, ambivalence, and the grouping are traits common to all men. We cannot measure anybody's dependability on the basis of his thoughts and feelings as they appear to us. In the first place, we can never know what lies behind the seemingly loyal facade. In the second place, the man who searches for truth leads him to explore many heretical points of view can be the most loyal in his actions. His very exploration may well lead him to consider a judgment that underlines true loyalty. What counts in any man is the consistency and integrity of his behavior, and his courage in taking a stand, not his conformity to official dogma. And to state that the government can search its own soul is to state absolutely nothing. A government is, after all, merely a collection of individuals. Under the pressure of loyalty compulsion, of the growing suspicion, these individuals themselves may not search their souls as honestly as they would be in less hectic times, or if they were acting as private individuals rather than as official representatives of the government. The man caught in official security rules is the prisoner of the anxiety and insecurity lamped in those who want to establish the delusion of certainty and security, a transgression of values. As soon as the government starts to search the souls of its citizens, it begins to intrude on their rights and interests. It attacks democracy at home and weakens its position abroad. We cannot find the road to peace and fellowship with the rest of the world if we adopt dogmatic, intransigent position and try to impose our own orthodoxy on others. The hallmark of the totalitarian in this insistence that this is the only right way. If we are to maintain our position as the leader of the free world, we must always keep our mindset open. Only in that way we will find new ways to peace. We have seen now that the problem of treachery has to deal with the failure to understand our inner mental processes. Every betrayal is the first step of self-betrayal, a disloyalty towards one's own standard. When people silence their concerns and compromise for the sake of convenience, at the moment they begin to be disloyal to themselves. Passivity. When people silence their concerns and compromise for the sake of convenience, at that moment they begin to be disloyal to themselves. Passivity, assumed when our concerns should have forced us to act, is the most common form of self-betrayal. Inwardly, a man may be furious because of some injustice he has witnessed, but outwardly, he may be doing nothing about it. This behavior he feels inwardly is treason to the self and is often what makes him so touchy toward other people's flaws. When the pattern of passivity is repeated, the individual continuously piles up more feelings of injustice and grows more and more resentful against society. Evasiveness and skillful dodging of issues of principle, these are among the most dangerous forms of self-betrayal in our time. They are dangerous because they lead cleanly to the hypocrisy that puts power beyond ethical value. It is dangerous to let personal grudge and discontent solidify into a permanent resentment against the whole of society. Parents and educators can forestall such difficulties through psychological insight by allowing each individual the freedom to criticize and attack, in a civilized, non-destructive way, the community to which he belongs. By helping to develop in the child a sense that he is responsible of his own views, subversive though they may temporarily appear, parents provide him with the opportunity to overcome his feelings of loneliness and ambivalence and his wish to do violence to those who influence him. Again, loyalty is a relationship. Loyalty to family, friends or country has to be deserved. Loyalty is possible only when mutual mental aggression and hostility are allowed and tolerated within the limits of the law. This verbalized, sublimated, and civilized form of aggression presupposes fairness and good sportsmanship. It is the synthesis and conquest of rebellion and subversion. However paradoxically it may sound, democracy is founded on the mutual loyalty of political exposed groups. You cannot doubt the good motives and the intentions of your opponent without undermining the basis of cooperation and successful government. It is most undemocratic to impute disloyalty to the opposition party. History shows that only where there is opportunity to confront and integrate opposing ideas can man eradicate that form of psychological ambivalence which gradually turns into disloyalty to oneself and the community. Fear of subversion and opposition is often fear of ideas. Fear of being identified with certain unacceptable ideas. The fear of betrayal of the hidden part of oneself. Fear of treason will exist as long as loyalty opposition is a crime. Democracy is non-conformity. It is mutual loyalty, even when we have to attack one another ideas which, because they are always human, are always incomplete. End of chapter 14.